it's a carpentry job or whether it's plumbing or whether it's in fact graphic design, you approach it generally with a set of tools. And some of those tools, and that's true across the crafts, are tools that you probably ended up making yourself uh, or can make yourself. Now, those tools might include the fonts you're using, and those are fonts you didn't make probably, but you did choose them, and you chose them with an eye to them working together. And it also includes a page structure, which includes a grid and column format, and generally a approach towards text. And the importance of text, really, you're not going to understand it, most of you, until you go through this process of creating a body copy for your theoretical magazine. And the reason is because it seems like, all I do is I pick a typeface. Okay, I'm going to use Times New Roman, or I'm going to use Politico. That's a font I use later in this demonstration. Done. But the font you choose and how you use that font is going to dictate later on, when you're in the meat of making magazine pages, it's going to affect your approach to design. And so I just want to look at this spread for a couple of reasons. Quickly, one is if we look at this typeface, and we're seeing it fairly smallish, but it is relatively open and inviting. It's not super amount of space between lines of type, but it's fairly open. And that openness is reflected in the fact that this is kind of a sort of spread. It's not super dense. It has a fairly generous amount of white space at the top. It has this extra column built in for the credit information or for the caption or whatever that is. And it has that same space matched here in this little sidebar. And one of the things we'll talk about later on is creating a primary body, which is usually a serif, and a secondary body, which is usually a sans serif, so that they can have a contrast to each other when they're used together on the same page. So this sidebar is in a sans serif, or one of the sans serifs that this magazine uses, and the main article, the main running text, is in the primary serif, and this font is used at this size and at this leading, space between lines, and with this sort of approach to the first little bit of bolds included throughout this magazine. Now, there's one other thing about this page, and the reason I picked this is I want to show it, is that this is basically readers send in with questions. I'm sure you're familiar with that format, whether it's Dear Abby from the old days or whoever's doing that column now. A reader writes in and asks a question, and then the expert answers it. And I just want to let's see if I could zoom in on that a little bit. Well, we can't, but if you, even from here, you can see that the question is in italic and the answer is in Roman. And the question is also flush left, it's ragged. You can see that there's more white space sort of in there on the side. And the answer is fully justified. And why is that being done? Well, for a contrast between the question and answer, so a reader gets, who becomes used to this format, and it's been this way for years in the magazine. This is the New York Times magazine, by the way, gets used to that rhythm and understands it. But why these particular choices for this particular type? Well, italic is a little bit more like cursive. It's a little bit more flourishy. It sounds a little bit more personal. And so the questions are selected for that as if someone wrote them in almost. I mean, not literally, but it sort of harkens to that. And why is this column justified? Well, it's justified because it is speaking with authority. This is the expert who is writing, and this text is written, straight up all the way down to suggest that this has some formality and authority to it. And so when you get into your body, I mean, most of what you do will not be questions and answers, but how that you want your tone of your magazine to be, and how you want that to play out in the type, is going to affect how you approach design later on. And I just want to look at a couple of examples of that in InDesign. So I have here 2 pages of type, but they have the same font. This is Publico Text, which I use for one of my projects. And this is also Publico Text. If you look up here, you'll see that they're both 9 point. We'll just flash on that again. This is also 9 point. But there's a couple of differences. One is that this is justified and this is flush left, and that's done just by selecting the this justified button here. I could make this justified by selecting that. I don't want that justified for now anyway, so I'll make that flush left. And these paragraphs are indicated with an indent, and these are indicated with a little bit of extra space between them. Now, a couple of other things are different too, in that this page, and both of these are, by the way, on a regular grid. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you can see we're in one InDesign document, so it's possible to have multiple grids within one document. And this one is filling its page more. It's denser, it's justified, so the justification sort of enforces that density. The smaller margins enforce it. In this case, this is just InDesign's half-point margin. And this has a little bit more generous margins, especially at the top and on the outside of the spread. And these are all part of a compatible set of decisions for this type. So this is airier, it's flush left, it has bigger margins. All of these are telling one story about the sort of the openness or the aesthetic of these magazines. Now, when would you use these 2 different styles? Well, it's conceivable you'd use them in the same magazine under certain circumstances, but generally this is probably speaking of a more serious topic. This is speaking of, I don't know, maybe we talked about shelter magazines or housing good magazines, something where you're going to have short type and you're going to have relatively open pages. Now, I should say that when you start mixing up this set of decisions, and there's places to go in between here. This text is just like super. I would probably give this text at least another half point of leading, rather than it just has a 1.5 more than the actual size. But when you start to mix and match some of these decisions, your decisions become, at least have the danger of becoming a little bit incompatible with each other. So for example, the reason this is something that you would legitimately see once upon a time, especially in the 80s. This is what was called a sculpted bottom of the page, where none of the columns quite line up. But I did that for 2 reasons. One, it's a decision that's highly compatible with this extra space between paragraphs. And 2, this approach to type just requires a more open approach to design. So even if I just pull these columns down, I think I'm gonna leave that grid off so we can see what we're doing. Already this text seems a little bit at cross purposes with itself. It loses, it's a very dense page, and these are actually fairly long paragraphs. This is the same article as it happens for both of these. But it seems like this page is just not quite working. It's like it doesn't know whether it wants to be loose or dense. And then I could do a couple of other things. Let's just select that all, just Command A on a Mac, and let me reduce that leading a little bit, and let me justify it. And I should say, with justification, there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can what's called a force justify, where you're pushing all the lines exactly to the end of the line, or you can have the last line centered. To me, that just looks a little bit fussy, but this is the justification. This one actually does come in handy once in a while, but this is the kind that you'll want for most of your text, where the last line is set flush left. And then, so now that this has some sort of feeling of denseness, but the open space between the columns and the filled, it just seems like a page that is not compatible with itself anymore. It seems like a page that's a little bit at cross purposes. And so it is up to you for your magazine whether you want to go for an open or a dense page, but just know the decisions you make now are going to affect your approach to design later on, because this already just seems not quite right and it seems hard to handle. So what are the consequences of this? Well, the first is that your pages are going to be less efficient. They're just going to need more white space on them, like I had with the extra space at the column, at the bottoms of the column, so your texts are probably going to have to be shorter to get this sort of approach to design to work. And you're also going to be designing things in a fairly different way, and you have to accept that you want a approach to type that is compatible with your topic, but also compatible with the way you want to design. So this is actually a variation on a actual print piece I did. Now the headline and the story are unrelated, but they weren't in the old way. And so here I have a picture. I have a headline that is taking up a fair amount of space. It's very big and bold. The text is dark. It's sort of like the aggressiveness of the density of the text is reflected in the other design decisions and the sizing of the type. Now, I didn't spend as much time on this page as I probably spent on that one, but I tried to give an example of the sort of approach if you were going to do this as an article starting on a single page. The text spills onto subsequent pages. But if you were going to do that, that would probably affect a lot of the other decisions you make. So this, in case the article starts, just a little drip of it on this opener. There's a balance of white space, some in the middle, along with some balance sort of at the top of the page. The white space is distributed, and I think it's white space when you use it does have to be incorporated into your design, not just left at the bottom of it, which can make a page seem unfinished. The art is probably a little smaller. It wouldn't necessarily have to be, but for something like this is the sort of decisions, at least for me, that more open type and those bigger margins leads to, is just a design that carries that out, that sense of openness of the page out throughout the design. So if you want to design denser spaces, if you want to have more room for art and less room for white space, then you are probably going to have paragraphs that use an indent. If you want to design a looser, more open, airier layout, then you're probably, well, you could still do indents, but you're probably going to be making decisions like flush left rather than justified text. And you're probably going to be making decisions like extra lead between paragraphs, and I could just pull that up so we can see that that is in fact the same text. Those kinds of decisions, and it's going to lead to designs that, if you are being true to the structure of the page you create, are going to be compatible in those sorts of ways. And I even have a little bit of lightness in the headline, so still a little bit of visual interest with that gradient, but it's even the lighter font and also the lighter color for the typeface. All of those become, to my mind, compatible decisions. So everyone is going to be designing a grid and a body text that works together, and you are going to become increasingly sensitive to the connection between the two as we go on. Be a little bit patient with yourself at first, because it does take a while, but you're going to be designing a body text, which is almost always a serif, a secondary body text for sidebars, and secondary text, and that's usually a sans. And you'll see lots of examples of fonts being used in that way, particularly if you go to my FOB Pinterest page that's on the syllabus. And both should come from a family with at least 4 variations. You always need an italic in case a magazine or a publication is mentioned. And it's nice to have a bold and a bold italic too. I tend not to use those, or my sans serifs in text. I tend to prefer a bold sans serif for more of a contrast, sort of like what you're seeing here. That's a sans serif mixed in with the serif. That's sort of a proof of the family. I mean, there's a lot of really bad families there, and if someone invested the time into that family to make sure there are at least 4 variations, then you know it's sort of proof that it's probably okay with text. Now, especially these days, and especially if you have access to Adobe Type, there are a lot of fonts around that are not meant to be used as texts, and some of these you're probably familiar with, like Papyrus or Comic Sans. These fonts are novelty or display fonts. They might, well, I've never found a use for either of those, but there are fonts like some of the wood types that are just appropriate for display or use at large sizes. And but if you see a font with the word display or banner or big or caption or another term in the title that suggests the font is not intended for text use, well, there probably is a text font included with that same font, not always. But I can just show an example of that. This one is Publico Headline is the name of it. That indicates it's intended for headlines. And the difference between that and the regular Publico, if we compared these up close to each other, is this one would just be higher contrast. The thin parts of the letter get thinner and the thicker parts get thicker. Now, if we tried to use this at text size, it would just kind of break apart on the page when you printed it. You might not notice on screen, but when you eventually print your pages, it would be problematic. Which eventually you'll be able to do if you can't now. Your 2 fonts should look together and work well together. Sometimes there are fonts that are designed specifically to be used together, like InDesign's font. Myriad is designed to be paired with, it's Myriad, it's the Sans, and it's meant to be paired with Minion. They have the same designer and they're very compatible. Speaking of that, they should be on the same letting. That's part of the compatibility. But part of what makes Myriad and Minion, including a general approach to them lining up, or looking together and having similar proportions as they line up. You may find that your Sans, if they're not meant to be used together, are a little bit different in size, so you may have to adjust them a little bit so that they line up across if they get used on the same line of type. I would say your type should be no smaller than 8.5. That's about the smallest for adult reading, and probably larger than 10.5. When you see fonts that get much bigger than that in the 11 or the 12-point range, you're probably looking at reading material either for the very young, new readers, or the very old who do not have the eyesight that they once did. So, for example, Reader's Digest has a large print edition for old people that they print I think they're weekly, that they print every week, in addition to the regular one that has type optimized more for readers in their prime of life. And finally, your final body should include the same approach and settings for paragraph indication. Don't worry, I'm going to show you those if you don't know where they are. And you should also pick a relatively neutral font. You don't want whatever your typeface is, like if you picked Comic Sans, that would just be a distraction on the page. People would not be able to focus on the words. They'd just be thinking about it being in Comic Sans. And Beatrice Wade, who wrote one of the most famous essays on typography, she wrote an essay called The Crystal Goblet. And she said basically type should be like wine. You shouldn't notice it. You should notice the wine inside the glass. You can have a beautiful engraved goblet that has, beautifully made. But if you're more focused on the goblet than the wine in the glass, then the goblet is not doing its job. So you want to pick some fonts that also don't limit what you can do. You want to be able to use those as tools to do whatever design you want. And then finally, you're going to do 2 versions of a grid, one with a lower top to accommodate signage, just a little bit more room at the top of the page. And we'll talk more about signage, and you can start to think about the difference you want there as we get more confident with your type decisions. So what I want you to do, we can generate out of InDesign Greeking. I could just make a box and I could say, oops, I'm a little bit out of there, but you can see say fill with placeholder text. The trouble is these words tend to be longer than most English writing. They're based on Latin, and Latin words just are quite a bit longer because they conjugate in different ways than English. So pick a regular English text and pick something that is preferably in the area of the subject you're going to write about, because that will give you some idea about the average length of paragraphs and the sense of writing. Basically, you'll be doing a lot of reading in this class because you can't really design a text without reading it. You can't really make a design that reflects the structure of that text if you don't understand that structure. So there will be some reading necessary, and I would encourage you to read that text too, just to get a sense of it. It also could be something that eventually goes into your magazine if you want it to. So the first thing is the grid, and you could start by answering yourself some basic questions. So I could say new document, or just say Command N as the case may be, but that would just be under File. And, oops, wrong key. Okay, new document, here we go. I am pleased to say I'm replacing this computer as it's sometimes a little bit slow, as I've seen there. So most magazines, if you have any lying around, you'll notice are not exactly the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet. Most students in this class do just pick a basic 8.5 by 11, but just know that you don't have to. The size of the page can be part of the issue, can be part of your aesthetic of the magazine. So I'm just going to go, I have my computer set up for picas. And just a reminder, I'm working in the typography workspace, but we can scroll open our margins, and our columns is already there. And I can pick a number of columns. I would start with 3, I think. 3 columns is just a really standard, really readable format for a magazine grid. We're going to talk about other types of grids later on that can be useful tools. And right now, I think I did that by accident. There we go. So this is probably what you're seeing. A 1/2 inch margin, in my case 3 picas. There are 6 picas in an inch, and so 3 picas is 1/2 inch. That is InDesign's default. The other thing that's InDesign's default is these are usually locked. So if you start to bring them up, they'll all come up together. And that's usually, if I was going to customize this, not what I'd want. There's also space between columns. That's also a place where you can add white space. I did not for this because, but you'll notice some magazines have a slightly bigger space between columns. But I'm just going to leave this at 1p. That's pretty standard across magazines and newspapers, but it doesn't have to be something you could accept it. Now, InDesign is also a facing page document by default, and so I'm going to leave it at facing pages. And I am going to, as I said, white space, readers tend to respond to it better if it is on the outside and on the top of the layout. So I'm just going to take this top layout, I'm going to click it, let's say 5p. I'll just type that in. And for my outside, I'm just going to make that a little bit smaller, 4p. And some people would make a little bit more room at the bottom just to accommodate a folio or a page number or something like that. I think 3 is probably plenty big for that, so I'm going to just leave it at that. And then you have your master page, and you can just pull this down. And we can see that we do in fact have a symmetrical layout. It's a little bit different than the default. A little bit more space on the outsides of the page and a little bit more space on the inside. And if I wanted to make a second master, I could just select this A master. And you'll note that all these pages have a little A in the corner. That indicates that they are based on this master. There's also a no style, and I could pull that down. And as it happens, the no style matches my A master because it was what got defined when I made my A master. But a lot of times my magazine, and I'll probably walk you through that at some point, has a bunch of different masters with a bunch of different column structures and purposes. So if I want to take this master, I can just say duplicate this master, and I get a B master. And then I can click on that, and I don't even have to look at it. I can just select them, and then I could go to layout, margins and columns. I'm sorry, that's slightly outside my viewing area. And I can change any of these. I can make the columns, I can make it a 4 column. I can make it a bigger gutter. Let's say 1 pica and 1/2. And click OK. And I can just drag that B master right on top of it, and I will see my new structure. And by the way, master pages can also have other things on it, like page numbers, so you don't have to individually put a page number on every page. And it can also have signage if you're doing a section that's sort of branded. It could have like the name of the section up at the top where it says in the news, or Industry Insider, or that's the sort of thing that the sort of sections that magazines tend to have, especially in their front of the book. So we could just do that again. So here's back this again. So now that I have this page selected, and by the way, I could change it to an individual page as well. If I want to mess with a particular page and not create a new master, I can do the same thing. I could go to layout, margins and columns, and let's just boost that up to 3. So InDesign is a hugely powerful program, and it makes you find a lot of that power on your own. And it has defaults that are like generally fairly bad for most purposes. So one of the things I said earlier in this lecture is, you're probably, for adult reading, you probably don't want to be much above 10.5. And so you open this up, and what I did was I just poured this font in from the other thing, and I applied what is called, or as it comes in, if you bring in a text, this is usually what it'll look like, unless you've created a style sheet, which is basic paragraph. And if I bring in another text, or if I paste from the internet, or if I go to type and I say fill with placeholder text, you can see it's exactly the same thing as this. These are the decisions. And it is, in fact, 12 point. It's big enough for kids writing. It's probably about typewriter size. So if you were using InDesign to write business letters, you might want to keep this. But if you are sending more than one letter, if you are involved in a magazine and you're concerned about it seeming like an adult product, and you're concerned about the text not taking up the whole room, because the more room the text takes, the less room you have for fun stuff like art and display typography and making the magazine effective. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this text a little bit smaller, and I'll just pick 10 point. And one of the things you'll may have noticed, is when I made that smaller, the space between lines went smaller too. So if I line up my text here in the original, just basic paragraph, well, it's taking up almost 3 of these down. And by the way, I could do this all, and we can move that down to sort of 9 too, just by clicking on the up arrows here. But if you look down here, that's the leading, and this is true, I think by default in most of the program, is as the text gets bigger, my leading gets bigger as well. And so no matter what, if I leave it on auto lead, it's always going to have the same density. Auto lead has another problem too, which is I'm just going to take one character, and I'm going to use my key commands this time to make this bigger, which is just Shift and Command, or Shift and Control, I think, on a PC, and my right caret. And if I accidentally make one of my letters a little bit bigger, well, the auto lead is going to respond to whatever the size of this letter is. So this is all 18 from the type I made bigger, but here it is 32. And if I select this all, that's blank. It just says auto. So it's generally a good idea, both for the aesthetic of your magazine, whether you're going for a more open or a more dense approach, to set it in a real lead. So let's select this all. I'm going to take it back down to 9. And I am going to take the leading down to, let's just make that a little bit more generous. And I think I am also going to, well, let's leave it flush left and look at putting a little bit of extra space between paragraph. So one way is you could just do a return. And by the way, you can always, under type, show hidden characters. And I could see a little invisible character for the end of the paragraph and an extra one for the return. That's not a way I like to work for a couple of reasons. One, they can be easy to delete, they can be easy to get rid of, and B, this text is really long paragraphs, so I could probably get away with it for a text like this, but most magazine writing is shorter and breezier, and too many full returns look, just sort of, it makes the page look choppy and disconnected, especially if you are going for a denser look. It sort of undermines that, and it's just really too much space for many purposes. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and InDesign has, hopefully you've talked about this in typography, it has two essentially workspaces. One that is focused on characters. Bafflingly, leading is in that category. I don't know why it is, because it's really a paragraph control. And paragraph controls. And these allow you to put space both above a paragraph and below a paragraph. And so what I'm going to do is look at my leading, which is 11. And I think a good place to start if you are doing a paragraph extra space would be half of that leading. So half of 11 is 5.5 points. I'll just type that in. And that is one way to indicate a paragraph. So the other way to indicate a paragraph is to just give it a little bit of an indent. And let's select it all again. And a good place to start is what's called the M square of that font. So this font is 9 point. So I am just going to I'll put a little 9 after the P. Before the P comes picas, after the P comes points. And I now have a indication of a paragraph. And actually, I have two indications of a paragraph. If you go back and look at the articles we looked at, often I won't indent the first paragraph in an article, and we'll talk about creating variations of your body in a future episode. And the reason is that I don't need to. It's obviously this is a paragraph. The style change and the fact that it's at the top of a column, or if it had come after a break in the articles, a lot of articles are broken up into pieces, it's obvious that that's a paragraph, so it doesn't need the indent. And likewise, nothing needs a space and a indent. So you should really just choose one or the other. You don't have to say this is a paragraph, and by the way, this is also a paragraph. Only one method is really needed. So I am going to, I think, get rid of my space after and leave it an indent for this case. And I'm also, I think, going to justify it. And under paragraph, these would be over here under character, but some of these things duplicate, but just rearranged a little bit. I'm just going to make that a paragraph. And if I have access to a printer, I am going to print this out because it's just really hard to evaluate type that's intended to be seen on screen on intended to be seen on paper on screen. But I know not everyone probably has access to a printer, so just do the best you can. And that's part of why normally I would not put such tight restrictions on type size. But one of the biggest issues is type can just look much smaller on screen than it really is. So I've seen a lot of students sort of pump up the size in the past, but you should be okay if you are between the 8.5 and the I think I said 10.5 that we discussed. So this is the start of a body, and that is fine. I would like you to just sort of make a page more or less like these, just completely stuffed with text. So there's nothing distracting, there's no pictures, there's no headlines. It's just text so that we can look at it by itself as we work into it. And you can put your sans or your alternative on another page, or you could keep it on the sidebar if you want. That probably doesn't matter too much. And that is a starting point. But just note that your approach to type now is going to affect your approach to page design later on. And but it just can't be helped, because you have to build the tools before you can build the house. You need the tools before the house, and these are sort of fundamental tools. The good news is they may be tools that it's possible to change a little bit later on. And to make this is just a series of type decisions right now and grid decisions. To turn this into a tool, we're going to turn it into the same sorts of style sheets we made, because it's really, rather than remembering the font name and the font size and the leading and all that stuff, it's so much easier when you can just say, oh, that's my body copy. And this now matches exactly what I have going on upstairs in the other well, actually, no, this is the base style, so this is a little bit different. But it could match that exactly, and it could match it exactly across multiple documents and multiple months. And so I'll be showing you in a future episode how to turn your type decisions into style sheets and how to do variations on those style sheets. For example, a no indent version, or a version where the first line of the paragraph is automatically bold, or a version where the first paragraph starts with a drop cap. Style sheets are complicated and they can be frustrating, but we'll try to help you through those as best as we can.